Hi, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Alexis Sablone, and I'm a skateboarder and designer, and today I'll be sharing how, for me, those two worlds intersect. I'm assuming you're not all skaters, and hopefully I'm not wrong about that, because before getting into any of my work, I want to spend some time talking about skateboarding. I want to tell some stories and examine how this odd practice involving a piece of wood and wheels has grown into a global community of individuals obsessed with reinterpreting the urban landscape. You probably recognize this building. This is the New York State Supreme Courthouse, downtown on Center Street. As a room full of people invested in architecture, I'm sure each of you could stand out front here and point out some of its features. The Corinthian columns, the elaborate decorated portico up top. If you're a skateboarder, though, you'd point out this. And as a skateboarder, your familiarity with the site would be historically rooted. It would be focused on form, material, tectonic, and yet it would have nothing to do with the so-called architectural history of the courthouse. This list represents every documented skate event that's taken place at the courthouse over the past 30 years. Or in other words, this is a skateboarder's history of the New York State Supreme Courthouse. So skaters possess an almost encyclopedic knowledge of who's done what where, and I bet you some of them could probably recite a list like this with shocking accuracy. And that might seem bizarre to you now, but I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, you'll come to understand a little bit more about skate culture, and maybe even share in my belief that the way skaters relate to, value, and transform the built environment is unique and really worth looking at for anyone thinking about or designing public space. Scan through this list and you'll notice that while the names of the skaters sometimes repeat, the tricks they perform never do. Like other creative disciplines where an artist's work can be referenced but should not be duplicated, in skateboarding, similar principles apply. So once a skater performs and documents a particular trick at a particular spot, other skaters won't repeat it. They'll find their own way to move to interact with the site. Some skaters set themselves apart through their choice of spot, so they'll reject skating established sites like the courthouse altogether and instead comb the city searching for unique unskated terrain. But in either case, in skating, event and site are inseparable. Architecture is never just a generic container. It's the site-specific impetus for performance. And through that performance, hold on, technical difficulty. I don't know. Okay, I'll keep going. Imagine that's playing. Okay, so in this way, through singular performance, skaters leave their mark in the city and are afforded a kind of ownership over the places they've invested their time, passion, and vision into. And I don't mean ownership in like a capitalist sense, because what's claimed here has no inherent financial value and can be shared by other skaters who continue to interpret and reinterpret the same spaces in new ways. Nevertheless, to the skate community, it's through this process that the identity of individual skaters becomes meaningfully linked to particular structures and places in the city. One of the first skate videos I ever watched was a video called Welcome to Hell. It featured an all-male crew with the exception of one skater named Alyssa Steamer. And as a 10-year-old, her presence in this video was really my sole source of evidence that other female skaters existed. In the final trick of her part, she approaches from the left in slow motion. The camera pans right to reveal this sloped triangular form. She jumps, gaps into its surface, and rolls away. About 20 years later, I visited Miami and was skating downtown with friends when we arrived at the triangle. I knew this spot, but I had never physically been there, so it wasn't until I was standing in front of it that I realized I had to try to skate it. I wanted to experience it with my own body. And the realization honestly made me feel a little bit sick because it's a scary spot. That's the view from the top. But I tried. The process was challenging, as it so often is in skating. I fell multiple times. I nearly got arrested. But I came back a couple hours later, and I was able to roll away. And thank you. But this is probably one of the most meaningful tricks I've ever done. It connected me back to a time when everything about skateboarding was still brand new, and to this person that I'd looked up to for years. So while this particular story is really personal, amongst skaters, the experience is universal. There's a sentimentality that non-skateboarders might feel when visiting prominent landmarks or historic sites. But the sites of skate heritage are sprinkled everywhere and are not always courthouses or memorials like the ones I've shown. But more often than not, they're unassuming everyday blips in the landscape. A street median, a gap in the sidewalk, a fire hydrant on top of a hill. Still, as skaters, we value these places because they're sites of nostalgia for us. They tie us to past generations of skaters, as well as to our younger selves. But connection to site isn't always routed through decade-old memories and nostalgia. Sometimes it's a much more embodied, ephemeral experience through which we as skateboarders build a connection to a site. What can't readily be understood by watching a few short clips is that behind each trick is often a process so physically and emotionally challenging, it becomes really hard for someone who doesn't skateboard to understand. A single trick may require hundreds of attempts. It may require starting at dawn or sneaking around at night when the threat of getting kicked out is high. It may require returning to the same spot multiple times, days, weeks, months apart. But throughout this long and intense process of trying and failing, skaters learn to adapt their bodies to the forms and rhythms of a space. They repattern their movements to line up with gaps in pedestrian flows and changing traffic lights. They modulate their speed and angles of approach, aware of the precise place on the ground where a tile is raised or a chunk of granite is missing or smooth ground turns into rough. But it's almost always a long, enduring, and really revealing process. So even in cities where private life often slips into public view, friends celebrate, couples break up in subway cars, most people reserve the more intense aspects of their nature for the protected privacy of domestic space. But for skaters, the streets really become a second home, and everything from joy and pain to triumph and failure is experienced out in the open. And it's this emotional process that connects skaters to the physical sites of their experience, but also it connects them to one another. Pushing and testing yourself to personal limits in front of a stranger means you don't stay strangers for long. So it's no surprise that skaters build strong and diverse communities. Today there are about 85 million skaters worldwide, with female skaters actually representing the largest growing subset. Even though skate communities increasingly expand through online social networks and skate parks, still today, and certainly historically, public plazas have played a central role in the health and resilience of our global skate culture. So for centuries, the open spaces of plazas have provided a place for overlap and convergence in the city. And for skaters, they've done exactly that, becoming a natural nucleus for the local skate scene, providing a constant backdrop to the informal, unscheduled, and often spontaneous nature of skateboarding. Around the world, wherever plazas have provided a place smooth enough to accommodate the rotation of 50-millimeter wheels, skateboarders have flocked. As the site where lifelong friendships and mentorships form, the place where entire generations of skaters have spent their adolescence and continue to return to well into adulthood, you can start to see how the attachment to a plaza builds. So when one of them gets destroyed, it's devastating to the skate community. The story of Love Park demonstrates this best. That's the slide you're looking at now is Love Park, was Love Park. Love is arguably the most cherished skate spot of all time. When it was demolished in 2016, I know multiple people that snuck into the construction zone just to grab chunks of rubble because they wanted to keep a small piece of love forever. In 2021, this skate article came out sharing images of the off-site location where the city had been storing stacks of Love's dismantled pavers, and skaters had been traveling there, breaking in, repositioning the tiles into new skatable configurations just so they could keep skating Love. And in perhaps the strangest plot twist, the city of Malmö, Sweden, where there's a vibrant skate scene, worked with the city of Philly to acquire some of the tiles, and they've since rebuilt a one-to-one replica of a portion of Philly's Love Park in Malmö, Sweden. And Love Park Malmö will open to the public in 2 weeks. As I move into sharing some of my design work, I want to first show this short clip from the Tokyo Olympics.
Sablone dropping in. And kick flip 50-50 on the ace there, Hubba.
Okay.
Wow.
So that's me trying a trick on a solid concrete railing as the announcer refers to the obstacle by its technical name, a Hubba. So the etymology of that term dates back to this classic San Francisco spot from the 90s. At that time, the word Hubba was a colloquialism for crack. People used the space to engage in illicit activities because it was partially sheltered from view. So when skaters started showing up in the early 90s to try to skate these symmetric concrete railings, the two groups shared the space. And the skaters nicknamed the spot Hubba Hideout. Hubba Hideout went on to become such a fixture of modern street skateboarding that the term Hubba became synonymous with the type of concrete railing it featured. So today we call Hubbas all over the world. We have Hubbas here in New York, Hubbas on every continent. So although the last few decades have seen skateboarding grow into a mainstream presence with purpose-built training grounds all over the globe and podiums inside of the world's most prestigious arenas, its essence, down to the very language we still use, comes from a subculture born out of street skateboarding. So I've spent the better part of my life now as a skateboarder, and in that time I've witnessed and participated in the ways it's grown and changed. But it's really only in the last decade that I began thinking about skateboarding more critically. Skateboarding was not the reason I studied architecture, or if it was, I guess I just didn't see it at the time. To me, skateboarding occupied opposing poles. On the one side, you had this growing world of skate parks, spaces designated for skateboarding, great for building skills and community, but also conceptually rigid, fenced off, disconnected from the streets. And on the other side, you had street skateboarding, which for decades has transformed architecture designed without knowledge of its existence through deliberate, artistic, and even rebellious reappropriation. So maybe it was because I was too close to skating that it took me a while to realize there might be an interesting space for design in between these two poles. Eventually, I began imagining other urban typologies and started to think about ways I might integrate skatable forms into more open-ended, interactive public spaces and sculptures. My design process began by trying to collapse and catalog the spatial conditions skaters seek out. I arrived at the following. Banked surface, so not a vertical wall, not level ground, and ranging in scale from a cellar door to a San Francisco hill. Change in elevation, from the unit of a stair to a roof-sized drop. Exposed edge, from bench to handrail to hubba, any edge condition that offers the skateboard a place to latch onto and find new equilibrium. Thread the needle, an aperture or space between two solid objects, big enough for the body to fit through, but small enough for the associated thrill and risk and spectacle. Gap in plan, two level surfaces with a space in between, or a chunk excised from a larger surface, from street gaps to the space between two water towers. So all skate spots employ one or a combination of these simple conditions. And in my work, I've sought to recombine these elements into new forms that are usable, playable, but not at once legible. This project, for example, is situated along Lisbon's waterfront, whether it's a place to meet up, skate, play, or simply a place to sit down and rest. It's really not my place to say. The point to me is that it's there, it's asking to be engaged, It's open to interpretation. Skaters don't need to be told, and children certainly don't need to be told. They find ways to interact, and I don't know, I personally love that, and I find that inspiring. Candy Courts. This project sits across from a middle school in Montclair, New Jersey, a kind of vibrant and active sculpture garden. These skatable pieces occupy a vacated pair of tennis courts. And the young skaters in this community fought hard, organized, and spoke really eloquently over the course of years to win the city's approval to use this space. The adjoining courts function as a DIY space, so skaters continue to build new, lighter weight pieces, and they drag them all around. So as a result, the space is really alive, constantly evolving, and being remade around these more permanent sculptures. Sunseed is on the grounds of a community center in Richmond, Virginia. There's a ribbon-like path exiting the existing skate park, linking it into this pavilion meant to be shared by skaters and the broader community. Its tinted oculus allows a moving yellow sliver of light to play along its surface, marking the passage of time and connecting the experience of passing time with the pleasure of this childlike pastime. Lastly, and this was my first project ever built, Lady in the Square in Malmö, Sweden. I think probably just down the road from where this new Malmö Love Park has been installed. A lady only by name may be more aptly characterized as strong, brutal, certainly challenging to skate. She's a collection of forms that defy definition, yet her presence is solid and undeniable as she occupies this plaza. For me, she's a response to a void that I felt was there, something I experienced for decades as a non-male skateboarder. But it's been really remarkable for me to watch and witness all the ways that this beautiful community of skateboarding that I love has finally begun to change and shift all around her. To close, I guess, I'll just say that, I grew up in an era where absolutely nobody liked skateboarding, except skaters. So I wouldn't have had the opportunity to stand up here and talk about this. And if I had said that talking about skateboarding belonged in an architecture summit, people would have laughed at me. So skaters were just disrespectful punks and vandals. The irony there is that all along, in their own way, skaters have cared more about the urban landscape than most people could ever imagine. And as a designer, I think I've really latched onto that fact, and to this notion that the love for a city forms when a person has agency, when the city becomes playable. So my work, is an ongoing project to make new spaces that conjure that spirit in skaters and non-skaters. And maybe it's a utopian mission, but I hope from these spaces more diverse, engaged, and caring communities can grow. That's all. Thanks.